Grace, mercy, and peace to you, Internet, and welcome to Lutheran in a Strange Land. My name is Matthew E. Cochran. I'm a contributor at The Federalist. I blog at the 96th Thesis. And our goal on this channel is to help you learn to understand which way the wind is blowing in our culture, in our philosophy, in our theology, so that we don't get swept away by all the lies and deceit. Now, we're starting a new video series today entitled Between Babel and Pentecost, a Christian analysis of multiculturalism. Why? Because I'm increasingly seeing certain political positions of Christians being driven by bad theology. I certainly don't object to our theology informing our politics. I think that's a very good thing, as long as your theology is sound. I mean, a lot of people try to keep their theology out of politics, but it's one of those things that never really works. Our God, and I mean that whether it's God or whether that's an idol, our God is always going to be the most important thing in our lives. And that is true whether a person is religious or not, whether their God is, Jesus or Allah, or whether their God is science or even themselves. Our God's always the most important thing. So who our God is and what that God says is always going to order all of the other values and concerns in our lives, including our political concerns. And that is as true for Christians as it is for anybody else. So while the Bible doesn't give us a specific political program, it does teach values and principles that sometimes do have political implications. So because of that, Christians can't really be religiously neutral in politics. Nobody can be religiously neutral in politics. You can pretend to be neutral. You can virtue signal about it. You can pretend that your God isn't really a God. But ultimately, you can't even answer the question of why should I be neutral without committing yourself to certain values and principles. And those are always going to be influenced by your God, by whatever you think is the most important thing. So theologically informed politics, it's not only fine, but it's inevitable, which is precisely why we need to be careful of errant theology informing our politics. So this series, it's not about specific politicians or parties, but about dominant political philosophies that are a big part of both major American political parties, specifically multiculturalism and globalism, because of the way that they deal with the idea of nations and the politics thereof. Now, multiculturalism, it's certainly more dominant on the left, but the right has its own versions of multiculturalism. And globalism, that is extremely common on both the left and the right alike these days. They look a little bit different on different sides of the aisle, but they heavily influence both sides. And in particular, these philosophies touch on one very pertinent political controversy at the moment, and that is the mass immigration and dissolution of national borders that we are experiencing here in the United States, and that's also going on in Europe to a large extent. And it's one of those issues where the Bible is being used by both conservatives and liberals to promote a specific position, and it's being done really badly. And you know what? I would rather it were done well instead. So to figure out what doing it well looks like, we are going to be taking a look at two related and defining stories in the Bible when it comes to cultures. Those are the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis and the day of Pentecost in the book of Acts. And I say they're defining because when it comes down to it, these two stories, each of them tells us a great deal about life in what Lutherans call the two kingdoms. What I mean by that is the left-hand kingdom being the world around us, being society, being civil government, temporal authorities, that sort of thing. Whereas the right-hand kingdom, that's the kingdom of heaven, that's the church. And those are two distinct kingdoms. God governs both of them, but they are governed differently because they have two distinct purposes. Civil government is there for maintaining civil order, establishing some measure of peace and temporal justice in a fallen world. Whereas the church's responsibility, the right-hand kingdom's responsibility, is delivering God's word and God's promises to the world, to teach, to administer the sacraments, that sort of thing. So you have these two kingdoms with two different responsibilities, two different purposes, but the two kingdoms, they're distinct, but they're not hermetically sealed. from one another, okay? They overlap in every Christian who has ever lived, because each one of us is a citizen of both of those kingdoms at the same time. And we have different roles and duties in each of those kingdoms at the same time. And again, the kingdoms are distinct, the roles are distinct, but they are not sealed off from one another. They are joined in each individual. And the fact that we are Christians, that is always going to affect the way that we live in this world. It should affect the way that we live in this world. So these two stories, the Tower of Babel, that story does a lot to determine our way of life in the left-hand kingdom, particularly when it comes to divisions among different nations and peoples, because that's a story basically where nations were created in the first place. Pentecost, on the other hand, that determines our way of life in the church in a very, very different way. It establishes a gospel and a church for all nations, a message and a responsibility that transcends the nation. So, two different stories, two very different things, but affecting both kingdoms in very different ways. So that is what we are going to be talking about in this series. But before we continue, before I sign off for this one, I do want to pose a political conundrum for you. I want each one of you listening, ask yourselves, what course of action would you take in the scenario I'm about to give you? I'm keeping the details vague because I don't want to prejudice people's opinions, but here's the scenario. You are the leader of a great nation. In terms of things like power, wealth, significance, you're pretty much second to none at the time when you live. But there's a problem, and there's a big problem going on outside of your borders. Some of the other nations around you, they are facing a major, major crisis because there is a savage and warlike people who have come to prominence in the area, and they are viciously attacking these other nations. And, I mean, these people, they're some of the most brutal people who've ever lived. And some of these other nations, some have been subjugated. Others have just been annihilated. And those that remain, those who believe that they're next, naturally, they are pretty scared. So because of this, you're starting to see a whole lot of refugees. They are fleeing before this enemy because, as far as they're concerned, they cannot possibly fight and prevail. If they don't flee, they're going to die. And so a very large group of refugees from one of these nations has gathered at your borders. 200,000 fighting men, along with additional women, children, old men, and so forth. And they are pleading with you to let them in. They promise they will pledge their undying loyalty to you and to your nation if only you agree to give them safe haven within your borders. And their culture, and it's not exactly what you're used to, but they're certainly not like the people they're fleeing from. And they even share some measure of religious beliefs with you and the people of your own nation. So what do? Do you let them in? Think about that, and I want you to remember your answer. Because at the very end of this series, I'm going to ask you the same question. What would you do? And you can see whether or not you've changed your answer based on anything that we have talked about. So please like, comment, subscribe, share, and join us next time when we kick things off by talking about the Bible versus modernism at the Tower of Babel.